Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little music chat on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, music parodies, specifically historical parodies. Now, there's always been, of course, music that looked to the past, or music that depended on music of the past. You couldn't have a Bach cantata without a Lutheran chorale. But on the other hand, you don't see, for example, Josquin writing a parodistic mass to make fun of the style of Guillaume Dufay. I mean, it just didn't happen that way, did it? Even though all of those masses were based on plain chant or some pre-existing material or a motet or something, it's an old and tried and true procedure. But in order for parody to happen, you needed to have a certain set of historical circumstances. In particular, you had to have composers who I think were either embittered or in despair or had concern about the direction of music's progress, and so who therefore were looking to the past either for inspiration or just the opposite in order to make fun of it and perhaps promote what they were doing. One way or another, you had to have this perception of your place in music history and a knowledge of what that history was, and a knowledge, moreover, that history was probably greater than what you were doing. Now, the first composer, I think, who really had that sense, although not in a parodistic way, was Mendelssohn. And the best place to find it is in his early string symphonies, which chart the history of the symphony, basically from C.P.E. Bach through Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, all the way up to the present Romantic period, when he finally emits his first actual symphony. It's a wonderful series of works that tells you just how important history had become. But Mendelssohn was nothing if not serious, and none of his music was outrageously parodistic. On the other hand, when we come to his colleague, Louis Spore, who was sort of a colleague, there he is, and we get to Spore's Sixth Symphony, the Historical Symphony. Now, the Historical Symphony is really a terrible piece of music. I mean, there's a lot of Spohr that's terrible because Spohr was basically embittered about the status of music in his own lifetime, and in particular, the popularity of Italian music, which he regarded as absolute trash compared to the sublime, fabulous, and wonderful German music of his day, specifically his own, because of course even Beethoven he regarded with a certain amount of skepticism for his noise and vulgarity. His idol was Mozart. So the Historical Symphony has four movements. It begins with the Bach and Handel period, and one of the reasons the piece is such a failure is because calling the Bach and Handel period the Bach and Handel period tells you nothing, because the styles of Bach and Handel have almost nothing to do with each other. Then comes the Haydn and Mozart period, two other composers who I guess you could sort of, imitate in a generalized way, the classical style. It's probably a little more Mozart than Haydn in Spohr's case. Then a Beethoven scherzo, because a scherzo was the only thing that Spohr could think of that he could attempt in Beethoven style without lapsing into that vulgarity of which he thought Beethoven was all too susceptible. And finally, we get to the current period, which is Spohr's vision of a bad imitation of Italian opera with nasty percussion smashing around and lots of dominant seventh chords. And I mean, the whole thing is just awful. And all it goes to show is that Spohr had absolutely no sense of humor whatsoever. He was much happier pretending to be sublime, which he couldn't do either, but at least he could not do it in a way that was a little bit more plausible than when he was trying to be gently humorous. But if you want to hear what a failure a historical parody could be, then you can't do better than Spohr's Historical Symphony. This one, by the way, is Howard Shelley conducting the Orchestra della Svizzera Italiana on Hyperion. And there's another series on CPO, modern series of Spohr symphonies conducted by Howard Griffiths. So there you are. But when we get further along in the 19th century, we begin to find the cause of historical parody gaining a little bit more traction, especially among the late Romantic composers, those terribly disaffected creatures. One of the most affectionate is the first movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony, which is a neoclassical work in the best sense. And then you find pieces like Prokofiev's Classical Symphony, but that, of course, is Prokofiev, in an affectionate kind of parody. I'm more interested in kind of the outwardly parodistic or bitter or somehow, a little bit more musical hostility, or sometimes just plain fun. One of the most interesting is this work. This is the score, actually. It's been recorded on CPO. Emil Nicholas von Reznicek's Third Symphony, which he says is written in the old style. The style he refers to is really Schumann. I mean, that's his model. And you hear lots and lots of Schumann if you listen to the symphony. Schubert, Schumann, that crew. Von Reznicek was nothing if not an embittered modern composer. Almost everything he did was a parody. His two big tone poems, Der Sieger, the Victor, which is about anything but victory, or Schlemiel, which, whose title sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it? And there's a scene in there's a bacchanal at one of these pieces that has, a witch arriving on a pig with her pendulous breasts swaying in the breeze. I mean, it's completely nuts. So in his symphonies, he was trying to be taken a little bit more seriously in the sense of making fun of the actual German symphonic tradition. And his Third Symphony does that. It's another work, I think, of very questionable success, but there's no doubt about what his intentions were. Moving a little bit further on, there's a piece that I just love. I mean, in terms of successful historical parody, that's genuinely funny and not necessarily embittered at all, really, but just very, very well done. I keep it on my iPhone for safekeeping. See if you can see this. Franz Waxman, his variations on Auld Lang Syne. Now, the Auld Lang Syne variations are just wonderful, and they begin with a variation in the style of Mozart, followed by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, sort of, with the wrong tune attached to the accompaniment, and then an absolutely wonderful solo violin Auld Lang Syne variation based on the Bach, the famous Bach chaconne for solo violin at the from the partita, which is really completely nuts. It's bonkers. And finally, he brings us to the modern period with his homage to Shostakovich, a fabulous pastiche that effortlessly switches back and forth between the styles of Prokofiev and Shostakovich, particularly the scherzo of the First Symphony and the end of the Second Piano Trio. It's a wonderful, happy little jeu d'esprit, which I can't recommend more highly. However, the king of all historical parodies that you absolutely have to hear if you like this sort of thing, and I'm getting it ready here, is to be found in Volume 4 of Siegfried Karg-Ellert's Complete Works for Harmonium. It's his portraits, Opus 101, 33 portraits, every single one of which is a historical parody. And he goes through music history like no one you've ever seen before. I'm going to have to read the list here because, you just have to hear this to believe it. Here are the parodies, all for harmonium, mind you, little pieces ranging from less than a minute to more than 7 or 8. They are, you ready? Palestrina, Orlando de Lasso, Rameau, Couperin, Handel, Bach in 3 parts. It's a 3-part chamber cantata with a sinfonia, an aria, and a chorale, all for solo harmonium, of course. Then you get Gluck and Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, first period Beethoven, Schubert, Weber, Berlioz, Chopin, Mendelssohn, A Song Without Words, Schumann, Liszt, Wagner, Verdi, Johann Strauss, Brahms, a Bruckner Adagio, believe it or not, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, Grieg, Christian Sinding. Really, Edward MacDowell. It's unbelievable. And how do you tell the difference between Grieg, Sinding, and MacDowell? But he does. Richard Strauss, first period, Reger, Debussy, Scriabin, and Schoenberg. And then there's a sort of finale. But I mean, it's an unbelievable series of works. They were recorded by CPO, probably very difficult to find now. I don't think the series is still available. But Siegfried Karg Ellert, the king of the harmonium, was also the king of the historical parody in music. So I just hope that these little pieces that I've mentioned have given you some things to think about, maybe some music to explore in your spare time, or reason to dig around in your own collection to find some other parodies. I mean, for example, listen to Haydn's Symphony No. 80, the first movement. Is that not a parody of Gluck's Dance of the Furies? You tell me. Or maybe Koechlin's Les Bandarloges, which makes fun of Schoenberg and Debussy and other contemporary composers of his own day. There's so much to explore in this topic, and so much music that's witty and colorful and enjoyable, and sometimes terrible and awful. But even a failure, a comparative failure like Spore, is awfully interesting for what it says about the man and his period and his era. So thank you for listening to this little chat. Enjoy and keep on listening to everything you get your hands on. It's all worth hearing for one reason or another. And God knows at this time of the coronavirus pandemic, we have some opportunities to explore some things that we probably wouldn't otherwise be bothering with. So bother. Thank you very much.